Got a pretty cool video for you guys that I've been working on for probably like a month and a half now. I've been waiting for a lot of parts, but we're gonna be showing the entire rebuild of the rear differential, which includes installing the TrueTrack limited slip, setting the backlash, and the gear tooth contact pattern, and basically reshimming the entire carrier in order to make this unit work. So I think you guys are really gonna enjoy this, especially those who really like the technical in-depth stuff. So let's hop into it. So I'm doing the bearing removal on my old G80 locker so I can get the shims out from underneath it. And basically the only way to do the bearing removal on these is, well, there's two options. You can get the official Dana 30 bearing puller or the Volvo puller, but that's no longer made, and the official Dana 30 puller is like $200 or $300. And another option is to get this clamshell type bearing puller from Harbor Freight. It's a bearing separator and puller set. And basically what you have to do is you have to cut the cage here with a Dremel, and then basically pull the cage off and clamp the clamshell around where the actual rollers ride. Because if you don't and you try and clamp it under here, you're actually going to damage that shim. And if you damage that shim, then you're never going to be able to get the thickness of that shim. And you're going to have to basically reset up your whole carrier from scratch, which is going to take a lot of time. So you can see I basically got this off. I'm going to pry this off. I'll get the clamshell on and I'll show the pulling process. We're all set up. Once I got that cage off and all the rollers, I was able to clamp it around the surface here where the rollers went, and then basically I set up the puller mechanism, and I put a socket and a lug nut here to actually bring this up a little bit so I could actually have something for this to push on. And now basically we're just going to turn this wrench and it's going to slowly pull the bearing off. So I picked up a shop press, something I've been really needing for a while. It's a 20-ton shop press, because I'll be needing this to press on and off gears on the transmission and everything. And I want to pop the pinion out of the rear diff, so I basically just stuffed it with some bubble wrap. So that way, when the diff does press out, it doesn't just smack down on these metal plates. It'll hopefully get squished between the bubble wrap and the metal plate and won't damage any of the teeth or anything. So I'm gonna go ahead and see how all this works. It should work pretty well. And you see how that wrap caught it? So if I didn't have that there, it would just smack into the metal. So yeah, I got the pinion on. It is an impressive pinion for an all-wheel drive car. I mean, yeah, it's basically the 960 rear diff, but like, we got a lot to work with. I'm really excited with how beefy this rear is. This thing's gonna be able to really frickin' take a launch. But yeah, I also got the housing all power washed and cleaned up, and hopefully get that painted soon. But I want to, you know, clean some of this up, and I also want to keep knocking up my flanges, which I'm going to show next, but without having that heavy pinion and all that other stuff in there. So I'm going to head back home. Awesome shop press, and we'll start playing around with those flanges again, and hopefully get those off to machining. So I'm going ahead and getting ready to press the pinion off, or the pinion bearing, and basically put the clamshell underneath the bearing, and then we're going to rest the clamshell on these press plates, and then we'll press the pinion out. So I'll throw this on the tripod and we'll watch it in action. always put a box and something soft underneath so you don't damage the pinion. I also ended up getting the ring gear off. There's just 10 bolts here. I'm going to replace all these bolts because it makes sense, and obviously thread lock them. The OEM ones weren't thread locked. Yeah, I mean, it's a beefy ring and pinion. It's really not that bad. Let's see how many inches it is. I think it's like 7 something. I think it's a 7-inch or something. I don't know. Sorry to do it with one hand. About 8-inch. Not bad. And then got the pinion pressed off, pinion bearing pressed off. I mean, it's not that bad. It's pretty beefy stuff. I'm happy with it. So we'll get all the bearings in, and then we can start pressing stuff back together and cleaning up the housing and everything. And these differentials actually have a shim on each side of the diff under the carrier bearings that helps at the preload and the backlash. And basically, because of those shims, it's really hard to get a C or clamshell type puller under here without destroying the bearing. So in order to set up those shims and everything, you got to be, pulling these bearings on and off frequently to adjust the backlash and whatnot. I don't think I'm really gonna have to adjust anything because I'm just should be able to just transfer the shims over from this old G80 locker to my new differential. But what I did is I ground out the inside of this extra set of bearings, so that way I can basically slide them, on and off by hand. And then I can easily adjust the shims, throw it back in, check everything without having to pull these off, risk damaging them and whatnot. And it's still a pretty tight fit, so it shouldn't mess with the readings at all. And then when I'm done, I can press on, the fresh brand new bearings, and everything will be good to go. Pulled out the True Track in order to, show a little bit better what I'm talking about. So you can see this is the bearing I ground down, and you can see it just slides right over. Now it doesn't have any play. I didn't grind it enough so where this is moving around, it's literally just perfectly maybe 1/1000th of an inch bigger than the actual, journal that it's sliding onto. So you can see, pull it off, change the shim, put it back on, throw it back in the diff, check backlash, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think, I'm gonna reuse these shims, and I really don't think I'm gonna have to reset up the backlash and the gear tooth pattern, because I'm using the same gears in the same housing and only a differential change, and really the distance between here and the other bearing should be exactly the same. But I'm gonna check it anyway because it's good practice and I'll learn something or two. All right, so I'm picking up this video about a month later now. I basically was waiting on the companion flanges for this to make sure all that fit and everything before I actually went through with using this True Track limited slip differential. But one thing I want to point out, so I did try test fitting this in, and I could not get it to fit into the housing using the stock shims. And I was kind of curious of why that could be. And actually looking at it, you can see that little lip on the stock differential. So this ring gear on the stock differential is actually moved more towards this way. So what was happening is basically those shims are too wide, or those shims make these bearings too wide to actually get it in the housing. And also the ring gear by default is about, let's measure it. So the ring gear sits about, you can see it's about 4 millimeter difference. Actually, no, I think I did that wrong. Let me flip it around the other way. What we want to do is we want to measure the distance. Well, regardless, the ring gear sits in a slightly different spot on this unit than the stock unit, which basically means, I mean, the height's the same, right? All those bearing diameters and distances are the same, but the ring gear is just slightly offset a little bit more towards the pinion. So we're gonna have to re-shim this. It's definitely doable though. We're just gonna have to order new shims from Volvo or from McMaster-Carr or something, but let me throw this in and I'll basically show you what we're gonna have to do in order to calculate our base shims. So the first thing we wanna do in order to calculate our base shim for the carrier is that we need to check how much play basically it has in the carrier itself. So what I did is I set up my dial indicator gauge. I have this pushed all the way to this way, and you can see I got my gauge dialed out or zeroed out. And basically what we're gonna do is we're just gonna push it all the way that way, and that's gonna tell us how much play basically we're gonna have in this housing. So you can see, we push it, we get about 50 thousandths of an inch. We got a little bit more that time because it fell off. So I'm gonna get a more accurate reading, but it's about 50 thousandths of an inch. And then next we are going to put the ring gear on, put the pinion in, and we're gonna do the same thing, but we wanna see how much it is with the ring gear and pinion on there. I don't think we're gonna have to shim the pinion. I think we're just gonna have to shim the carrier and just get the backlash set up right in the carrier. I think the pinion's gonna be fine because really the only dimension that we're changing by putting in a new carrier is just the ring gear, you know, offset like this way or that way. So everything else should be fine, but again, I guess we'll see. So I'm gonna get all these measurements done. I'm gonna do the other measurement with the ring gear and everything, and we'll do the math and see what kind of shims we need to start out with. All right, so now I bolted the ring gear to the diff, just 2 bolts, and you can see we don't have as much slide this time. You can hear it a little bit there because the ring gear is actually butting up against the pinion gear. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a measurement. We wanna see how much this moves now with the pinion in, and then we can subtract the two and get basically how much shims we wanna put on each side to get this basically in the position all the way that way. And then we're gonna have to actually move it this way a little bit to set the backlash. So if we move it all the way this way, you can hear that backlash. You can see the gear moving. So that's good. That means we're gonna be able to set this up. Obviously this is too much backlash. This is probably like 10 thousandths or 15 thousandths of an inch. We wanna shoot for 5 to 7. But if we move it all the way that way, you can hear there's no backlash anymore because the ring gear is fully seated into the pinion gear. So basically what we have to do is we have to figure out the shims, well, at least the starting shims, and then basically adjust, put shims on each side to basically move this left or right and get that backlash to 5 thousandths. It's a little bit different than how we set up the angle gear. And then once that's done, we put a certain amount, let's say 3 thousandths of an inch of shims on each side, and that actually sets our bearing preload. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this measurement and we'll get an idea of basically what shims we need to start with, because these ones are way too thick. They don't even allow the carrier to fit into the housing. So we got this side set up, and you can see we got about between 15 and 20 thousandths of an inch of direction that way. So basically what that means is we have 0.050 50 thousandths inch total of left to right movement, and we have 20 thousandths of an inch with this in. So basically what we're gonna need to do is we're gonna need to start with a 20 thousandths shim here and a 30 thousandths shim here, and that's gonna give us 0 backlash. And then we're gonna have to shim this side and take away shims from that side in order to move it over to get our, that way, to get our 5 thousandths inch backlash. So I'm gonna go ahead and order a ton of shims up. I can get them from Volvo, but I'm gonna see if I can get them from McMaster-Carr too, because McMaster-Carr, they're a lot cheaper and you can get big packs of different sizes and whatnot. Or I'll just order the official Dana 30 shim kit, but I'd rather order something a little bit more universal from McMaster-Carr. So let's get this these shims ordered up and hopefully get this thing together soon. So I ended up getting some shims in from McMaster-Carr, 55 millimeter outer diameter, 45 millimeter inner diameter, and 0.200 millimeter thickness. And if you remember from last time, we had about 0.5 millimeters on this side and 0.8 millimeters on this side that needed to be filled in order to get this thing to exactly 0 backlash. So what I decided to do is, since we need about 5 thousandths of backlash, instead of putting 0.4 on this side, we're going to put instead of putting 0.5 on this side, like I had here, we're gonna put 0.4, and that's gonna move this over a little bit that way so that we get a little backlash in this thing. And of course, we need one preload shim on each side too. This is a 0.2 millimeter. Volvo calls for 0.13 to 0.2 millimeters on each side. And that's so basically you have to press fit the carrier in so it has preloads on the carrier bearings. Now on this side, basically, we need a 0.8. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We had a little bit more I needed on this side. Maybe my measurement was a little bit off. And we also have to add the shim that we took away from this side to this side. And then we also need our preload shim. So on this side, we ended up having 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 1.2 millimeters plus a 0.2 preload. And we ended up having 0.4 plus a 0.2 preload. And this basically got us at our 0.5 or a 5 thousandths of an inch backlash, which I'm going to show you guys right now. I also got these bolts all torqued down. These are brand new Volvo bolts, 979651. I torqued them to 70 foot-pounds. Volvo calls for between 65 and 85, or 65 and 80. I went for 70, it's about in the middle. And I also did blue thread locker on them, so they aren't coming out. And they also are, they're like serrated kind of, so they bite into the diff, so they're definitely not coming out. So those are nice and torqued up. They're grade 12.9 bolts, very high quality bolts. I was gonna get ARPs, but there's no point because these are already, factory ones are already grade 12.9. So what I'm going to do is we will throw these shims on. What we're actually probably gonna do is, I did check all this already using the old bearings, or using the new races and the test fit bearings. So we know this is all good. So what I'm probably gonna do is replace the pinion bearings and get all that situated. We don't have to move the pinion at all. We really just have to reshim the carrier. But let's just throw it in. I'll show you guys the backlash and the tooth contact pattern and whatnot, and show you that it is ready to go. Talking about here, you can see the carrier is actually set in, but it's not going in all the way because you actually have about 0.2 millimeters extra on each side. That's basically pushing this housing out and thus causing the housing to push back in and preload these bearings. So you can see, like, it's gonna take some force to get these in, most likely a hammer. So you can see we're gonna mount them in. And you can see this is exactly what you want. You want these to be a nice press fit, so that way you have preload on your carrier bearings so that they don't fail prematurely. Now I'm gonna get this put in all the way. I'll grab my dial indicator gauge and I'll show you guys the 5 thousandths backlash we have. All right, so I got everything tightened up. I got the caps torqued down with the old bolts. Got everything all in. I got the dial gauge indicator set up, and we're going to check for backlash real quick. We need about 5 to 7 thousandths of an inch, so we'll see where it's at and see if we need to do any adjusting, and then we'll check the contact pattern to kind of double check that. So if we look at the dial indicator, we got it zeroed out. It's all the way this way. Let's see what we get. We got about 4 thousandths. That's pretty damn close to what we want. A little under 4 thousandths. I was checking it earlier, but I didn't have everything torqued down, so it did change a little bit after I got everything torqued down. So about literally 4 thousandths. Okay, so we might need to, see, this is gonna be hard. We might need to maybe shave a little bit. These shims are so thin, I can't see it being very easy to shave any of that off. So we might need to try and just shave it off, or we might just leave it and run it at 4 thousandths. I think 4 thousandths will be fine. 4 thousandths is probably plenty for this size differential, but we'll play around with it. Let's check the contact pattern and confirm that everything's looking good on that, and then I guess we'll make a decision. Compound on the teeth, just did it on a couple. You can get this on Amazon. It's pretty common stuff. And I put one of the flanges in because basically when we turn this, we're gonna wanna turn the opposite way on this to try and load up the unit a little bit. If we turn it with some load, it's gonna give us a much more readable pattern. So let's run this real quick and we'll take a look at the results. And again, we got everything all torqued up. And if this looks pretty good, we'll probably throw in all new bearings and everything and do one more final backlash and pattern check and then probably send it. So we did the pattern check and it looks really good. You can see it's pretty much perfectly centered. It's a little bit towards the heel a little bit. So this drive side looks really good. You can see a majority of the patterns right there in the center here, and you can see it's perfectly centered between the top and the root. So that means the pinion shim is perfect. No need to change the pinion shim. We're gonna leave that alone. And then you can see the coast side doesn't matter too much, but you can see it still looks pretty good as well. But this is the side that matters, and you can see it looks like it's really good. We even got a nice clean wipe all the way through the tooth. So we got really good contact. Again, gonna see if I can maybe increase the backlash another thousandths of an inch. We'll play around with it, but looking at this, it's looking pretty good. I mean, it's gonna be really hard to get the backlash to increase a thousandths of an inch when we only have 0.200 shims, because again, these are so thin, you can't really shave them. And I couldn't find 0.1 millimeter in this size. It's just, I don't know why, it's just, you can't find any in the States. I tried a couple of manufacturers and they were delayed for 3 weeks, and I found some in the UK, but this is looking pretty good, so I'm probably gonna run this. But I'll keep playing around with it. 0.2 millimeter shim from this side and put it over this side, and I wanted to see how that would affect backlash, and it basically just about doubled it. You can see we got about 9 thousandths now, whereas before we had 4 thousandths. So what we need is we need a 0.1 millimeter shim. We need one of those freaking 0.1s that I couldn't find. So I don't know, I guess we're gonna search for shims. I think the 4 thousandths is a little too tight in the backlash. I think 5 or 6 thousandths, between 5 and 7ths would be a little bit more appropriate. I'm gonna see if Volvo can get any 0.1s. I know they had 0.08s and they had 0.13s listed. I'm gonna see if I can get one of those and hopefully try and get this finished soon, because this is just dragging on, this whole rear diff and whatnot. But I don't know, we'll figure it out. So I got it dialed in almost perfectly at 6 thousandths. You can see it's a tad under, but I'm gonna call that 6 thousandths. So I ended up basically, that one went a little far that time, 6 thousandths pretty much. I basically ended up just adding 1.13 millimeter shim here and removed a 0.2, so that basically moved it over, what's that, 0.07 millimeters. And then it still had the tiniest amount of preload. It basically slid in, but it didn't just drop in. I just had to push it in a little bit. And so I know that basically we had the perfect amount on each side, and now we just need to preload the carrier. The only thing is I wanted to preload it with 0.13 on each side, but we already used one of our 0.13s and we only got 2 0.13s. So I guess we might try putting a 0.2 millimeter on each side, that should be fine. That's at the end of Volvo's spec for a preload on each side, but that is kind of tight, and it was kind of hard getting a good backlash check when I did try preloading it at 0.2, because it's really hard to turn the ring gear. So maybe I'll try lubing everything up, and also got these caps torqued up too, so everything's all torqued up and everything looks to be good to go. We're just gonna have to figure out the best way to preload this. Probably gonna use these 0.2s, maybe use the 0.08s and see how it feels. We'll see. So I did the pattern check. Basically I put a flange in, and then I basically turn this and I apply pressure in the opposite direction to put some sort of load on it. You need to put some sort of load on it to get a good contact pattern reading. And if we take a look, you can see it looks pretty good. We have most of the wipage pretty close to the center. It's a little closer to the heel, but the important part is that it's perfectly centered between the root and the top, meaning that our pinion is at the perfect depth. We're not too concerned about the coast side, really. You can still see on the coast side, it's still perfectly centered between the root and the top. It's a little bit more towards the toe. That's a pretty acceptable pattern, having the coast towards the toe and the drive towards the heel. This looks pretty good. So we got our 6 thousandths backlashed, everything's torqued up, and we got a pretty good contact pattern. So I'm gonna say this thing's ready to go. So we're ready to put all new bearings in it, all new races, and then do this process again and make sure nothing changes. And hopefully it shouldn't, because those bearings are manufactured to a very tight tolerance. You can see, let's get a better view. Looks pretty good. Come on, focus. There we go. You can see that's actually pretty well centered. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm ready for final assembly and final check of the rear diff. So I'm pressing on the outer pinion bearing. You can see I got the shim on there as well. Basically, you just got to get a 1 5/8 inch outer diameter tube. This is just some aluminum. You don't need anything too crazy because it's really not a whole lot of force that it requires to press this on. But we're going to go ahead and keep pressing it and see it moving. So we're going to get this pressed on and we can start checking the rest and putting the new races in. So I have things dialed in really close. I'm really close. I went from a 0.13 to a 0.08 on this side to open up the backlash a little bit after putting in all new bearings. Things tightened up just a little bit, only like a thousandth. So basically right now I'm back at 5 thousandths. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. You can see we're right at 5 thousandths, which is at the lower edge of the acceptance range. But honestly, so a tighter backlash is going to generate a tiny bit more heat, but I think it's going to be able to hold a lot more power. And obviously higher backlash is going to generate less heat, but not be able to hold as much torque. So I think 5 thousandths is going to be perfect for this thing. It's in spec, it's a little lower, but I think it's going to be better for a high horsepower build. And we also put 0.13 millimeter shims on each side and got a perfect preload. Spec calls for 0.13 to 0.02 or 0.13 to 0.2 on each side, and we got a 0.13 on each side, which should be pretty perfect. I might try the 0.2s on each side and see if it tightens it up too much or not, but this went in pretty hard and it took a decent amount of force to hammer it in. So we're going to do a pattern check real quick, see what it looks like, and if it's good, I think we're going to send this one. Ended up running a contact tooth pattern check and it came out pretty good. Pretty happy with it. You can see it is very nicely centered between the root and the top. You can see we got paint that goes all the way down. And you can also see it's pretty well centered between the heel and the toe. But it is a little bit, tiny bit more towards the root, which is okay. Really happy with how that came out. And if we spin it around on the other side, you can see again, it is perfectly centered between the root and the top. And it is pretty damn centered between the heel and the toe. So I'm really happy with this contact pattern. I think that came out phenomenal. That looks really good. It's not like perfectly defined because it is a used gear set and it is kind of hard to torque this thing up or load it up by myself because you got to load it up with some torque. But you can see it is very well centered. I'm very happy with that. So we're going to leave it at 5 thousandths inch backlash because we want to run a little tighter spec because it's going to be able to handle more torque. It's just going to generate a little bit more heat, but I'm not concerned about that. And we're going to run that pattern, and that's really good. And also we need to set the bearing or the pinion bearing preload, which we're going to do with the sleeve that we're basically going to shim to set the preload instead of using the crush washer. Because these crush sleeves, what can happen is when you're putting a ton of torque through these things can actually crush from the torque you're putting through it from the angle, from the angle gear. And if they crush a little bit, you lose bearing preload. That pinion's going to start slopping around. You're going to destroy the whole gear set. So by using an eliminator, which I'll show next, that thing is going to be solidly shimmed. It's never going to be able to crush, and we're just going to have to torque the nut on. And obviously, we're going to have to shim it to get the correct bearing preload. I think it's around like 20 inches or something like that. But yeah, really happy with this. That came out awesome. So I'm going to keep chugging along. I'll show you the process of setting the pinion bearing preload. Is setting up the crush sleeve eliminator. So you can see we have the original crush sleeve, and basically how this works is you basically torque down the nut, and you have to torque it a lot, like 300-400 foot-pounds to actually get this sleeve to start crushing. And when it does start crushing, it's going to start moving the outer pinion bearing towards the inner pinion bearing, and hence setting the preload. And then basically this sleeve, the tension on this is basically going to hold that preload. So you basically would keep torquing the nut, and then you would check it with your inch-pound gauge. And once you reach that preload, then you're done torquing the nut. Now, the issue with these, like I said in previous clips, is when you're putting a lot of torque through the pinion, like drivetrain torque, this can actually crush down a little bit more. And what happens is you start losing bearing preload. And if you lose bearing preload, your pinion's going to start slopping around. You're going to basically destroy your gear set. So what we have here is Ben from Kaplinki Racing made some of these up for me real quick, and it's basically a crush sleeve eliminator. So if we look at it, you can see it's a little bit smaller than the actual crush sleeve. This is 14.5 millimeters, so it's a little bit smaller. And basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna use these Ford 8.8 shims, 1131 RA Tech. And these are actually for another crush sleeve eliminator kit for the Ford 8.8, but they will fit this sleeve perfectly and everything. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this sleeve on in replacement of the crush sleeve, and then we're basically gonna shim it back up to around 14.5 millimeters. And basically what that's gonna do is allow us to fine tune the preload. So we're basically gonna have to keep putting this in, taking it out, putting it in, taking it out. And basically when we torque this nut down, because this is solid and doesn't crush, whatever that nut's torqued to, 50 foot-pounds, 150 foot-pounds, the bearing preload is always gonna be the same. So we're just gonna give it a couple blips with the impact, make sure there's no slop in everything, and then we will check the actual bearing, or the pinion preload with this inch-pound. And I think we want around 20 inch-pounds for new bearings. So I'm gonna shim this up. I'm gonna try and get it as close to the old one as possible, about 14.5 millimeters, and then we'll throw it in, give it a try. So here you can see this little contraption I made to torque the pinion nut. Basically, I just stand on each side like this, and then I torque it up with my torque wrench. I got it set to about 105 foot-pounds for now. And yeah, let's check the preload real quick. I think it's gonna be pretty tight. You can see it's barely even moving. Yeah, it's way too tight. So we're gonna reshim it and try again. Changes make a huge difference. I went from a 0.75 to a 0.5 spacer, and the preload went from about 10 inch-pounds to, it's pretty close to about 52, 55. The spec calls for, I think it's like 26 to 52. So I think I'm gonna try cobbling up 0.6 millimeters worth of spacers, and that should probably bring me down to, I would think around like 40. I don't know, 60 minus 10 is 50. So let's say 55 minus 25. It's probably around like 30, 35, which is probably gonna be pretty good. So we'll try that. This is really just a trial and error, but 52 is way too tight, way too much preload, I think. Correct myself from the previous clip, the spec is 21 to 39 inch-pounds. Before we had 0.5 millimeters of shims, and that gave us 55 inch-pounds. Now we have about 0.65, so about a 0.15 difference. And we have, let's see, it's kind of hard to get this. Let's see, we have about 40 inch-pounds. So we dropped 15 inch-pounds per 0.15 millimeters. So it seems that 0.01 millimeters is about an inch-pound. I don't know if that's exactly right, but I think I'm gonna try going back to around 0.7 millimeters and try and get for 35. I could probably run it like it is right now. It's like between like 39 and like 42. It's probably fine to have a little extra preload, but I'd like to try and get it in spec, and I got time to play around with it, so I'm gonna mess around with it just a little bit more. All right, so I ended up taking a little bit off the sleeve, and I got it perfectly at 30 inch-pounds. See, it's right at 30. It's actually a little under because you can see my gauge is a little off by 2. So it's actually about 28, and that's perfect. Spec calls for 21 to 39, so I think 28 is spot on, and I think these bearings are gonna be nice and happy. So yeah, I mean, the crush sleeve eliminator kit, it's really nice because you don't have to really, I mean, obviously it's way stronger, but it just takes a lot more time for that initial setup. But in the end, it's gonna be worth it because it's gonna help keep those pinion bearings preloaded and keep this whole thing together. So I'm gonna do one final test fit with the carrier, do a final backlash pattern check, and then we can put on the new bearings on the carrier and do it one more time, and this thing's ready to rock. All right, so I got the new bearings pressed on. I was just using the test ones that basically just slid on and off. And we're doing our final backlash check and our final gear tooth contact pattern check before we fully put this together with new bolts, new seals and everything, and clean all the ring gear up from all the paint and everything. So let's see what we're looking at. We should still be around 5 thousandths of an inch backlash. And you can see we're pretty much exactly at 5,000 still. Let me just adjust that. Yep, so 5,000ths on the money. So nothing changed by switching out to the non-test bearings. I mean, they're the same bearings, just had the bored out a little bit so they could slide on and off a little bit easier. But yeah, pretty happy. We ended up doing, on this side, we ended up doing a 0.2, a 0.08, and a 0.13 preload. And then on this side, I think we did like 1.2 millimeters plus a 0.13 preload. But I mean, this was not easy to get set up. This carrier is a pain to shim, because whatever you do on this side, if you put shims on this side, you got to take them away from this side, and like vice versa, and you always got to set the preload with the shims. Or on the angle gear, you know, you just have to do one shim for each the pinion and ring gear, and you adjust the preload and whatnot with this. It was a lot easier to set this angle gear up, to be honest, which is quite funny, because this thing I started from scratch. I mean, this I started from scratch too, but man, this Dana 30 style carrier, huge pain. I know Volvo, they make tools like little adjusting rings that you can use to like set it up, and then you measure it and put the right shims in, but this was such a pain to shim, and I am very glad that it's all set up and whatever. So let's do the gear tooth contact pattern check, and we can get this thing banged out and done. And survey says contact pattern is absolutely spot on. That looks really good. Again, we got space between the root, we got space between the top, and that white mark is perfectly centered. That looks beautiful. That looks really good. And we're not too concerned about the coast side, but you can see it's nice and centered. And we do have, I think it looks a little bit towards the top more, because I didn't get a good load on it. But we're really concerned about this drive side, and that looks absolutely perfect. So this thing's ready to do the final assembly. We're gonna pull the caps out, we're gonna clean the ring gear, clean the pinion, put all the seals in, we gotta get a new nut, and then throw everything together, and that's the final pattern check. I'm not gonna do another pattern check because my OCD is going crazy with all these pattern checks. That looks great, that looks awesome, that's what I'm gonna run.